Joined by a stellar panel this evening. From my left, I have Dorothy Byrne, the former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4 Television, who is now president of Murray Edwards College at Cambridge University and the author of Trust Me, I'm Not a Politician. Also to my left, on the near side to my left, is Jardine, the Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West, who is the party's spokesman for the Cabinet Office, Women and Equalities and Scotland. To my right, I have Lord Peter Lilley, Conservative peer and also former minister in both the Thatcher and Major governments. And on my further to the right, Angela Epstein, the journalist and broadcaster who's written for and appears on a number of different programmes and written for many, many outlets. Now, there's so much to discuss this evening. You might want to ask our panellists about those events, those extraordinary events at the weekend with the Wagner Group, Evgeny Prigozhin and what was happening there. You might want to ask them about what we were discussing in the last hour about Rishi Sunak hinting he might not adhere to the independent peer review bodies. You might want to also think about asking about Stephen Lawrence, another suspect now being potentially identified by the police, and also Prince William talking about homelessness as something he wants to tackle over the next 5 years, or anything else on your mind. Feel free, you know what to do, 03456060973. Text on 84850. You can also ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. And don't forget, you can watch us live on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
So let's go to our first question from Richard in Gateshead. Good evening, Richard.
Hi, Ali. Ali, after to our panel also, after the Prime Minister says people have to got a hold of the nerve, does anyone in politics, and I don't care what party, and our panel included in this question, and yourself, the presenter, included in this question, understand what it's like to struggle? And some days can't even afford to buy a newspaper. Does anyone understand what it's like to struggle in politics these days?
Understood, Richard. Does anybody know what it's like to struggle? And I think the more broader question you asked was, the Prime Minister said, hold your nerve regarding interest rate rises. Does it look like anyone in politics understands what it's like to be a normal person? Do the panel understand? Lord Lilley.
Well, we can only try to empathise, and one has in politics to do that, to empathise with people in totally different situations from oneself. As a member of Parliament, you get those people coming to your surgery week after week, so you do know firsthand how they have problems and so on. The sort of follow-on from the question is not do we understand, but what are we going to do about it? And the answer is we can either just let inflation rip, in which case the disruptive effects that it have will affect even more people, or we can try and bring it under, let the Bank of England try and bring it under control. And that, frankly, is what we've got to do. And there is no painless way of controlling inflation. If there was, every politician in the world would have jumped upon it. But
Lord Lilley, do you understand when we were discussing this in the last hour, when politicians say we're all in it together, and you see that income inequalities growing in the country, productivity is so low, and you see that the top 10% of earners are actually getting rises way above what the independent peer review bodies are saying for the public sector? Do you understand that there is angst, anger, frustration out there with the government?
Yeah, oh gosh, I certainly understand it.
As a former cabinet minister,
I both understand it and know it directly, because it's hard to find people who aren't frustrated with the government these days, even in the circles I move in. So but can you find an easy way of taking it out on the very rich? Well, if we can take money from the very rich, I'm more in favour of doing that. But if you take too much money from them, you don't redistribute money, you redistribute people, and they go abroad and they take their income abroad, and that's what we found before we came into power in 1979 and 83, reduced the very top rates, and people came back in and we got more money from it. The reverse could be done now if you wish.
Christine, you don't look convinced.
Feel good, but it won't achieve anything.
Christine Jardine, you don't look convinced at all.
I'm not. I don't think Rishi Sunak does understand. I don't think he understands how offensive it is to say to the public, you have to hold your nerve, when for a lot of members of the public, they have no option. It's not about holding the nerve. It's about getting through day by day. And do we understand? Well, I like to think I do to some extent because I come from a working class background in Glasgow, and I've been through the situation where you get through hand to mouth, day to day, and you can't make long-term plans, and you can't promise your children the latest gadget at Christmas because you don't know if you're going to be able to afford it at Christmas. But do I think this government understands? No. And I think by saying things like hold your nerve, they just underline how out of touch they are with the British public. And, we're in a situation at the moment where the public sector, where the NHS in particular, are calling for a pay rise. The peer review board has looked at it and recommended 6%, and the government is saying, actually, no. And it's their review board. So I think the more people hear this government, Rishi Sunak in particular, talking about the economy and talking about what they have to do, they think they don't understand. They don't understand. People come to my constituency every week, and I fully appreciate what you say, Lord Lilley, about empathising with the people who come to your constituency every week. I understand that, but they don't feel that this government does.
But he doesn't have to do surgeries anymore. That's one of the advantages of being a peer.
That's true.
But let me ask you this, Christine Jardine. When the government says we've got to hold our nerve, doesn't the Prime Minister have a point? Because we do have 400 billion of borrowing on the back of COVID. We've got 2.5 trillion of public debt. Sometimes economies and countries go through tough times. Mm-hmm. This is a tough time.
But he needs to offer people more than hold your nerve. He needs to offer a policy. He needs to tell people what he's going to do. What is he going to do about the state of the NHS, about the 7 million people on waiting lists? What is he going to do about the fact that you can't rely in this country anymore on an ambulance arriving when you've had a heart attack or a stroke? What is he going to do about the fact that people can't get to see a GP? What is he going to do about the fact that people are worried about their jobs? That's what people want to hear. By all means, hold your nerve, but do something positive as well. He needs to give them a positive solution, and we're not getting it.
Absolutely, and they'd like to hear from opposition politicians as well as from government supporters what you're going to do. I bet we don't.
Well, I'm quite happy to say that we would make it 7 days maximum for GPs. We would
just make
we
it
would
by
invest.
magic.
Where does the sorry? I'm apolitical, if you like, in terms of I don't. Okay, I wasn't voted to be here. I just got a phone call from a nice young man who said come and be on the panel, and I obliged accordingly. So I'm just a jobbing member of the public, if you like. I don't believe in competitive suffering, and I do hate the kind of hair shirt top 10 stakes about who has suffered more in terms of having licence or agency to comment. I don't mean in terms of our caller. But my mum was widowed when I was 19, was left in a fairly precarious economic situation. That doesn't give me any more right to say I empathise more or less than somebody who's been born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And I do loathe the notion that just because Rishi Sunak has he is highly solvent, to put it mildly, that somehow means that he doesn't understand people's pain. But I think what voters want, what we all want, is to know how you're going to get out of it. Keir Starmer often comes up with stuff that doesn't seem to be substantiated. It doesn't to be clearly costed. It's all very well saying there'll be £28 million on green energy, but where's the money coming from?
Well, they've cancelled that.
Because
they've reneged
exactly,
on it.
Absolutely. So, he's been called Sir Flip-Flop for the various U-turns. And this is not me. I'm not sort of campaigning for any particular party here. What I'm saying is it seems to me, for me, with my entry-level economics, either you tax the people or you find it, or where else does it come from? Because if Labour has a magic wand, then I'd really like to see it waved.
Well, I can't speak for the Labour Party.
Well, Dorothy, let's give you your
but I mean, it's like the key opposition party.
Yeah.
Dorothy Byrne.
I think if your only message to the public is hold your nerve, you're not going to win the next general election, are you? And, when I read that headline, I thought, what on earth is he talking about? Hold your nerve. And then it was in an article about people not being able to pay their mortgage. So what would you do? You'd go into your bank and they'd say, well, you've not paid your mortgage. And then you'd say, no, but I'm holding my nerve. And I agree with you. It was offensive, but I also think it was clueless. And what people are looking for now is to see some worked out policy solutions, and to just say, we're at the mercy of global forces, and hold your nerve. It's not enough for people.
But Dorothy, to be fair to the government, they've had this meeting. The Chancellor met bank bosses on Friday and mortgage bosses on Friday about trying to give more relief to mortgage holders, to give them interest-only periods, to extend tenors of mortgages where appropriate. The government can't be the lender of last resort in every situation. They did it in furlough. It costs a lot of money, and quite many people would, including myself, would say it was quite right to do so. But the government can't play the role of nanny state provider in every situation, can it?
No, and that isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying that you can't just say to people, hold your nerve.
So what should you say?
Yes. What would you like to hear?
You should present people, and what people are looking for is policies that offer to them in the longer term some sort of way out of where we are. And I do think it's very good to have some of those methods to alleviate people's problems. But in the end, if you're going to go on to an interest only mortgage, where are you going to be at the end of a year? And I think for a lot of people at the moment, it's very frightening.
But do you not think, Dorothy, that there is also a thing called personal responsibility, and interest rates have been historically low since 2007, 2008, but by historical standards, 5% interest rates, although they're crippling at the moment, I understand that, by historical standards, they're pretty average.
The problem is that people took out those mortgages.
But that's their issue, personal issue, isn't it?
But that's
Go on, Ed.
that's no consolation. I mean, I remember the 80s, and I'm not getting into competitive here, but I remember the 80s, I'm sure lots of us do, including Lord Lilley, and double-digit mortgages, 15% one day. We remember that. But the young generation who are taking out their first mortgages at the moment have no experience of that. But it's no consolation to them to say it was worse in the 80s, because they only know what they're going through now. And they can only appreciate what they're going through now. And it's not pleasant.
Of course it's
very, very painful for a lot of people.
They were encouraged to take out mortgages by these banks.
But that's the Conservative, I mean, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Conservative Party, but that's the Conservative dream, to create a home-owning democracy. That's the idea that you have. My two older children are renting, newly married, and they want their own home. I could
say
pie
in the sky
but
now,
I could
isn't
say
it?
to them,
it's not a dream, because they're not going to get that.
Yeah, go on.
And they're both professionals. They're married to lovely young women who are also professionals. Work really hard, education, all the things. Very good state school education, but still, it remains beyond their reach. There's no low-hanging fruit there. And we could argue, well, why don't we do what the Europeans do? In lots of European countries, they just have a rental culture. And that's it.
But the problem we have on top of that is that rents are going through the roof at the moment. In my city, in Edinburgh, they've gone up 13% in the past year, and that's the highest in the country.
The whole housing situation is very, very fraught, both for mortgage holders and for renters as well. You can see that it's already got off to a very, very interesting start. Different perspectives being shared by the panellists here. No easy answers. But if you have a question for our panel, you know what to do. 0345 6060 973. You can also text on 84850. Or you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC followed by your question. You're listening to and watching Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:17.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
You're listening to and watching Cross Question on LBC with Ali Miraj and my Cross Question panel of Dorothy Byrne, Christian Jardine, Lord Peter Lilley and Angela Epstein. Let's go to our next question, a text question from Albert in Croydon. Would the world be a more dangerous place if Putin left the Kremlin? Now, to just give you a bit of context about this, Vladimir Putin has just delivered a pre-recorded video message from the Kremlin vowing that the organisers of the weekend's rebellion will be brought to justice. So it appears that the Wagner Group leaders will not be allowed to just disappear into the night, although Yevgeny Prigozhin was not specifically named by Putin. Christine Jardine.
Well, I think that we all agree that Vladimir Putin is dangerous, but we've no way of knowing whether whatever replaced him, if he left the Kremlin, would be better or worse. We don't know. And there was a lot of hype at the weekend on Saturday about the Wagner Group and all the rest of it, but I'm not sure that I would have been any more happy with, in fact, probably less happy, with Prigozhin in the Kremlin than with Vladimir Putin. We have to, in the West, I think, just steal Rishi's line for a minute, just hold our nerve and watch. and in this circumstances, I think it is appropriate. And, back Ukraine, hold on to the thought that it did show that Putin is weak. But we have to hope that if he does leave the Kremlin, then he is not replaced by someone whose attitude to Ukraine and to the West would be worse. And we don't know at the moment.
Well, how can the
We're
West be
speculating about what's going on inside the Kremlin. We don't know.
If he's surrounded by a ring of steel, the fact that, he embarked on this illegal war 18 months ago, he thought it would be a done deal in a few days. He's now dealing with crippling humiliation and, international isolation. But the fact is that he must be surrounded by an incredibly loyal Praetorian Guard of some form or other. Otherwise, why is he so...
But there will come a point...
advocating assassination.
There will come a point...
They must be. Well, that's what we don't know. If they're loyal, then the...
But Angela, can I just challenge you on one thing? Because there's this impression that Putin is isolated in the world, and he's not actually isolated in the world. So there are many countries out there that are not getting involved or taking sides in this at all, including India, Pakistan, many countries in Africa and in South America as well. They're increasingly called the Transactional 25, who will act in their own interests. And they're very transactional when it comes to these matters. So we need to be a little bit careful that we believe in the West that we're pretty united and NATO's pretty united, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the world is.
No, I mean, there are always bystanders, and it's the old adage, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And I think I'm sort of nodding to the West when I talk about being isolated, because obviously self-interest is king in most of these places. But I think this notion that somehow he has remained so protected after what's increasingly, this war, there doesn't seem to be any end to it. And nobody seems to have challenged him politically, militarily, until what's happened over the weekend.
Are you worried?
I don't think we can be sure.
Are you worried that if he is deposed, something even worse could be put in its place?
I think that's a possibility, because if somebody bears his humiliation deeply and carries the so-called values, or they're not really values, but the nefarious values that he holds dear, and wants to carry on in his sort of footsteps, then yes, absolutely.
Dorothy Byrne.
I think your questioner asked something very specific, didn't he?
Yes.
Which was...
Would the world be a more dangerous place if Putin left the Kremlin? It is specific, yes.
And
that is specific.
I think we don't know the answer to that question. I don't, and I haven't heard anybody who did. There is an interesting point when there is somebody like Putin who has such a hold on power, is so evil to the extent that he almost feels to you to have a deranged vision of the world, that you can't help feeling and hoping that whoever came after him would act in a self-interested way and be more sensible and end the war in Ukraine. But we have no idea if that would happen. I can't even say that Putin is deranged. Yes. He behaves like a deranged person.
Could I come in? I have no more knowledge of what's happening inside the Kremlin than anyone else, so all one can do is look back in history and see what's happened. I used to read the entire Russian novelists as a child, and Tolstoy wrote an account of the Pugachev rebellion in 1773, which was some ways similar. It was the Cossacks, the sort of mercenaries of their day, rising up under Pugachev and marching on Moscow. They were much more successful initially than Prigozhin, but after 2-3 years, they were crushed by Catherine the Great, and it didn't destabilise her. She doubled down. Pugachev had announced the end of serfdom. She extended serfdom. So I think we would be unwise to assume this automatically will lead to the collapse of Putin, except, of course, that history is really no guide to the future.
Do you have any idea who could potentially take over from him?
Not at all.
This is the thing. We're all innocent. We're in bystanders waiting for... we don't know. It's too difficult to tell exactly.
Also, I just think that the general public, people like myself who read about the appalling suffering in Ukraine, we see that what people are sort of having to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and you just want to bang your head against a brick wall and say, what for? Will you wake up the day after you win and say, right, I'm a happy man?
Angela, thank you. That's absolutely indeed. Let's go to our next question from Lawrence in Manchester. Good evening, Lawrence.
Hello, Ali. Blah, 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 blah. Why is it that those that we elect or employ in the public sector always fail to address the issue of the day? 10 years later, 30 years later, etc., hundreds of billions, $100 million spent, and then eventually they say, actually, I wish I'd said the right thing at the time.
What are you referring to specifically,
I'm referring to specifically, including this fiasco going on in Russia, and the fiasco of what the debts that the nation's into, and in particular Stephen Lawrence.
Stephen Lawrence, yeah, absolutely,
yes.
Got the point. Yeah, got the point. Got the point.
May I just...
Yeah, that's fine, Lawrence. Thank you. We got the point. So why does it take so long for the people we employ to protect us to admit they've got it wrong? Angela Epstein, in relation to Stephen Lawrence.
Yeah, well, I mean, the developments over the last few days have been absolutely astonishing.
Let me just, thank you for that, Angela. Let me just give a bit of background here for the listeners, and then I'll come back to you again. The Met Police has admitted having made mistakes in its original investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, having now named a new suspect, Matthew White, who died in 2021. The then Commissioner, Dame Cressida Dick, announced the force had closed its case on the murder the year before White died. Sorry, Angela, go ahead.
So, look, I mean, confidence in the Met at the moment is not terribly high for lots of reasons, but this notion that the force was institutionally racist then casts a sort of a shadow over the nature of the investigation. Was it conducted thoroughly? Was it conducted with integrity? Clearly not. And the fact that I'm only sort of picking up the gobbets of information that I've heard in terms of those that were involved at the time, saying, I think that the young man who's now a grown man who was with Stephen at the time said there was a sixth person.
Yes, he's always said that.
He's always said that there was a sixth person. Why didn't the person who was with Stephen at the time that this heinous crime was committed not taken seriously? And it simply fails to understand.
Catalogue of failures.
Absolutely.
Catalogue of failures. Christine?
I think I agree completely with Angela. It's heartbreaking when you think about all the work, and I think we have to pay tribute to her, all the work that Baroness Doreen Lawrence has done over the past 30 years in the pursuit of justice. I can only imagine what she has been through and what her family has been through. And she has said that there should be serious sanctions against the police officers who failed to investigate White following these revelations. And I think she's absolutely right. Stephen Lawrence's murder 30 years ago was a moment when this country realised how badly wrong we were getting race relations and how much work we needed to do. And I think Have we succeeded? I don't know. But I think the fact that it's taken 30 years and the BBC have now come up with this name and this person who was involved, and as Angela says, the young man who was with Stephen Lawrence.
Yeah, now died, so we'll never come to
justice.
No.
And the young man who was with Stephen Lawrence said there were 6 people. So, I think it's appalling that 30 years down the line we're finding this out.
Dorothy Byrne.
It's not just a catalogue of failures. It's because the police were institutionally racist.
That's right, as Macpherson
and that
wrote.
Is a fact. I'm very proud that at Murray Edwards College, Doreen Lawrence is one of our honorary fellows. One of our visiting fellows is Mina Smallman. Mina Smallman's daughters were murdered, and then,
yes, appalling.
As we all know, the police photographed their bodies, thus demonstrating decades on an institutionally racist police force. And not only have we discovered that they're institutionally racist, but institutionally misogynist.
Well, that's what Baroness Casey just came out with.
Yeah. Years ago, we did a film, Undercover Policewoman, and in that film, the policewoman who was filming for us, a more senior female police officer said to her, well, if I was raped, I would never go to the police. And we have to face the fact that after all these decades, we seem hardly to have moved on at all.
We seem hardly to have moved on, Lord Lilley.
I think we probably have moved on, but what is extraordinary to me is we had an inquiry into the whole Stephen Lawrence murder, the police handling of it. It was very damning of the police, but it didn't seem to uncover this 6th murder or the failure of the police to seriously look at that. It doesn't seem to have resulted in punishment of the people, the police officers who failed so miserably in that thing. I don't know why. It certainly wasn't because the inquiry was sort of sympathetic to the police. They were obviously very damning of the police. I prefer the term cultural. They were culturally racist. That's much harder to eliminate than institutional racism. It still lingers on. I can't believe it's as bad now as it was then, but it's still bad.
Well, the Met is in dire straits still, even now. I mean, you've got Mark Rowley trying to reform, but even only a few months ago, Baroness Casey came out with it institutionally homophobic, misogynist, and racist. Decades on from Stephen Lawrence.
And the thing is, yes, Mark Rowley's doing a lot of work, but if there's one public service other than the NHS that you really need to depend on when you need them to be there for you, it's the police. And if you are a woman and you're being attacked and you can't depend on the police, or you're a black person and you're being attacked and you know that the police are going to be racist or you suspect it, how can you feel safe in this country? And that's not acceptable.
Well,
Indeed, we think of Sarah.
I don't think people do.
I was thinking about this, that if a young female relative of mine rang me and said, I've just rung the police because I fear a burglary or they've been the victim of some crime, I would immediately be frightened and would send people round to that house as soon as possible.
That's very, very disturbing.
That is what I actually feel.
Well, that's very disturbing that we've got to a situation where certain people in this country feel like that. That is a very, very tragic state of affairs. You're listening to and watching Cross Question on LBC. At 8:32, the news headlines with Tim Daly.
Following the brief uprising by Wagner forces in Russia over the weekend, President Putin has thanked the president of Belarus for helping to bring about a resolution. He's been speaking in a pre-recorded statement which has been released in the last half hour. Also this evening, the United States and NATO are insisting they had no involvement in the attempted mutiny on Saturday. Doreen Lawrence says it's infuriating no police officer will ever face action over failings in the investigation into her son's murder. She's been speaking after a 6th suspect in the racist killing of Stephen 30 years ago was identified for the first time. And Lambeth in London, Bournemouth and Newport are among 6 pilot projects supported by the Prince of Wales to tackle homelessness. They'll each get grants of up to £500,000. The rest will be announced tomorrow. LBC weather, cloud and showers will move on this evening, leaving clear skies for many, but there could be some rain in the northwest tonight with an overnight low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
You're listening to and watching Cross Question with Ali Miraj and my panel, Dorothy Byrne, the former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4 Television, who's now president of Murray Edwards College at Cambridge University and author of Trust Me, I'm Not a Politician. Dorothy, what's the book about? Does it do what it says on the tin?
Well, quite a lot of it is about Boris Johnson. To be
no shortage of material
frank, I got into trouble a few years ago for saying, what do we do when a known liar becomes Prime Minister? Well, now we know in the end we get rid of him.
Very good. Christine Jardine, the Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West, also the party spokesman for the Cabinet Office, Women and Equalities and Scotland. So you're very busy, Christine. Also, you were a former journalist. What made you go into politics?
I was a journalist for a long time.
And you taught journalism as well? I
taught journalism as well, but you see a lot of things when you're a journalist, and it makes you quite angry at times. And I had always been very political. My parents were quite political. I come from a political family. And you do, at one point, not everybody, but I certainly came to the point where I thought, do I want to keep writing about problems and broadcasting about problems and other people trying to fix them, or do I want to try and, do something about it myself? And that was why I
wanted to be a player on the pitch.
Yeah.
Excellent. And Lord Peter Lilley, who I've known for many, many years, Conservative peer, and also a former cabinet minister in the Thatcher and Major governments. I noticed, Lord Lilley, that you were a signatory to a letter which I think was in relation to the National Trust, saying that it had been coloured by Marxist dogma. What was that in relation to?
Marx is a critical something or other, aren't they? The critical race theory.
Yes.
Well, the National Trust, my mother was a great supporter of the National Trust. She used to spend her weekends...
National institution.
Looking after ancient houses and letting people in and out and so on. And it was not a political organisation. Now they feel necessary to tell us on one issue only how the owners or relatives in the past of buildings, what their views were, with a view of undermining our view of history, I think, because a one-sided view of history can't be a good one.
Okay. And Angela Epstein, the journalist and broadcaster who we cross in studios regularly.
Yeah, I'm going to become an MP soon now. I've seen the future.
Well, you've also been quite critical of feminists, saying that some of them are just not very pleasant for people who disagree with them.
Yeah, okay, so my tin hat on, but because my thing is I'm not a feminist, I'm an egalitarian, I'm a non-feminist. And the bra burners get very twitchy when I say that, because to me, you see, the problem with feminism is it marks its own homework. So you get a lot of militant women together, often spoiling for arguments over the small things like, why aren't women's pictures on banknotes? I just want to make sure I get the same number of banknotes as my male counterpart. And I just think it's a conversation that often excludes men, because it's all about the sisterhood, and actually sometimes women can be awful to each other as well, which I've seen too.
I think we all can.
Say I am proud to be a feminist,
okay.
And we stand by other people who are.
Thank you, Dorothy Byrne.
And we wear bras.
This wasn't even a question. This was just a little bit of
I just think it's a conversation for everybody.
Indeed.
That's
Indeed.
the problem.
Okay, let's go to our next. Thank you. Let's go to our next caller, James in Ayr. Good evening, James.
Good evening. My question is quite simple. Should outgoing Prime Ministers be prevented from appointing their friends and allies to the House of Lords?
Well, just to put it in context, Peter Lilley here was nominated for a period in spring 2018, not part of any resignation honours list, I might add. Dorothy Byrne.
Well, of course they shouldn't be allowed to do it. The people... While we have a House of Lords, the people in it should be wise, experienced and sensible people. They shouldn't be put there because they are the chums of the outgoing Prime Minister. And our last two outgoing Prime Ministers were so dreadful and were rejected by the people. So we reject them and then we end up with their chums for the rest of their lives. I mean, it's ludicrous.
Do you think, Christine Jardine, that there is a distinction between the general honours that they give in the resignation honours list and the Lords in particular? Because it's the Lords that seem to be the ones that really get up people's noses.
I think it's all to do with the House of Lords, and I am a firm believer, and we tried to do it, the Liberal Democrats during the coalition, that we need an elected upper chamber. We need an upper chamber, but we need an elected upper chamber, not an appointed upper chamber, because people can't have confidence in it. The House of Lords does a lot of work. I'm sure Lord Lilley would say more about that. And, while we still have hereditary peers in there, we really do need an upper chamber that people can have confidence in, that it's not the Prime Minister's chums who are being appointed to it. And we've seen a lot of questionable appointments over the last 2 years. But if it was elected,
would it not challenge the primacy of the Commons?
But you have to have democracy, and you have... But, at the moment, you have an unelected upper chamber that is huge, and as the caller has pointed out, you get departing prime ministers appointing their chums, and you get people in there who've made donations to political parties. We've had the scandal of Ledbedev being in there, and the objections to that. What we really need is an elected upper chamber that can do the job of an upper chamber in scrutinising the legislation that comes through, do the job which it does at the moment, but be elected to do it, and be people who are there through the choice of the public.
It's not just donors, Lord Lilley, who are in there. There's also a 29-year or 30-year-old aide who's had the fastest, most rapid political ascent in political history, from parliamentary intern to baroness within about 6 years.
Yeah, very strange. I'd assume there must be some established convention about retiring prime ministers having the right to do something. I find that there isn't much. So I would, if I were Rishi Sunak, I'd quickly invent one and say it is now a convention that you're allowed 1 for each year you've been in office, or 5 for each year you've been in office, or something, and that's it. The idea that there'd be an open-ended number for MPs, for prime ministers in a case of being chucked out by the lower house, is odd. But what about the upper house? The upper house has only one power, and that's the power to make the lower house think again. Say, you've passed this legislation to us, we think you should have this new clause, remove that old clause, amend that. Please think about it. And they'll think about it. When I was Secretary of State for Social Security, every time they amended one of my bills, my reaction was fury. How dare they amend my bills, which were perfect in every way, until I looked at the amendments. And then in every case, I accepted them in whole or in part. It does a good job. Would it, if it were an elected chamber, it would just be a mirror of the local chamber, of the first chamber. It wouldn't be full of all these extraordinary mix of people. Forget about people like me, but you've got cancer specialists, you've got generals, you've got former leading civil servants, you've got academics.
But you also have a lot of donors, cronies, and hangers-on, don't you?
A few of them, yes. But yes, we've got 86 Liberals, far too many compared with the House of Commons. They should go if they don't believe in it.
Well, they are actually, I like to think that they are there to work for their own demise with the replacement of the upper chamber with an elected one.
They could bring about their demise much more rapidly if they wanted to.
Well, we did try. We did try in the first couple of years of the coalition. But Conservatives and Labour Party didn't back us.
Do you not think that that Rishi Sunak should have vetoed Boris Johnson's list?
Yes,
I didn't.
Do.
I mean,
you do think
Dorothy does.
I didn't at the time because I didn't.
Do.
Well, I didn't
Sure
think he even had
really.
the right to. Now I realise he probably had the right to, and he probably didn't realise at the time that he had the right to. I think I would have at least pruned it drastically so that it was no longer.
Well, we've got Liz Truss. We've got Liz Truss. Should she get one? 49 days in office?
She gets a salad garden.
She ought to be allowed to make one peer, and that would be her husband. Poor chap, he's had to put up with.
Andrew Epstein.
I think that there should be an independent body that assesses the wisdom, literally, of people who become members of the House of Lords.
Well, it's called the House of Lords Appointment Commission, isn't it?
Okay, and it should be apolitical, because you want it to be a repository of wisdom, of experience. People like the late Jonathan Sacks, Lord Chief Rabbi.
Yep.
And if you look at his books, the man of profound, fathomless wisdom, I would say. He was not a political figure. He was just what he knew human beings. And I think that's what you want. It's a revising chamber. Presumably clearly they don't have ultimate say because it then goes back and the House of Commons make a decision. But I think that seems to me the most obvious way to do it. That's there. It's not there to score political points.
Well,
then it would be full of people like Dorothy.
But Lord Lilley, isn't it fair
to say wise older women,
wise, wonderful, left of centre people who become masters of Cambridge colleges? Yes. There wouldn't be anybody representing my views or the views of just 52% of the population.
Didn't Norman Fowler, when he was Leader of the Lords, and now it's John McFall, isn't it? Who's Leader of the Lords?
Yes.
Is it now?
John McFall's the Speaker.
Yeah, John McFall, sorry, the Speaker of the House of Lords. John McFall is saying that the political balance has been shifted because there are too many political aid types in there. And Norman Fowler, when he was in charge, was basically saying that it's just getting too big. It's become unwieldy.
Yeah. But haven't we also got too much of a culture of giving people garlands and rosettes? Because look at the honours system. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer is a Sir, for example, because it's the tradition for the outgoing Director of Public Prosecutions to be ennobled that way. It's not because, they served law and justice in an extraordinary way. That's what the DPP does.
Just before we go to break, sorry, I agree with your point, by the way, but just, Peter, you were suggesting that Dorothy might get a peerage. Is that what you're saying?
I'm sure if she doesn't, her clones will.
I have no
under this system, it will be full of left of centre lovies.
Dorothy?
I've set up the system.
Okay, one second, Dorothy.
You will find it's a complete mess at the moment. It's a great big assembly of random people,
and the geography.
Some of them awful, some of them not awful. It's just a mess.
Well, can I just say,
name 5 awful ones?
Can I just say,
there's no balance. It doesn't reflect.
Can I just say that if I was running the House of Lords, which I'm not, then all 4 of you would have a place in it on the basis of this discussion so far. You're listening to and watching Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:47.
LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
You're listening to and watching Cross Question on LBC with my panel, Dorothy Byrne, former head of news at Channel 4, Christine Jardine, the Liberal Democrat MP, Lord Peter Lilley, the Conservative peer, and Angela Epstein, the journalist and broadcaster. Now, the next text question comes in from Kyle in Derby. From Carlin Derby. Should someone with the kind of personal wealth which Prince William has really start preaching to the rest of us about battling homelessness? And just to give you a bit of context, the Prince of Wales has launched a 5-year campaign to end homelessness across the country. The anti-monarchy campaign Republic says William's intervention into this issue is crass and hypocritical. Angela.
Look, he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't. OK, you know, he sits on an enormous property portfolio. He was born with the fabled silver spoon. He hasn't known difficulty and hardship, you know, as sort of flagged up by our first caller at the beginning of the programme. But equally, I think he's a man of integrity and credibility. His mother brought him up to understand that there is a life below stairs, that people genuinely suffer. And the very fact that he's involved, at least he's shining a light on the problem. It comes back to the original point about Sunak as well. Just because you are entitled or ennobled or you have tons of money, it doesn't mean that you can't use that as a force for the good. And I think also, message to Harry, if you're listening, actions speak louder than moans. You know, at least William is saying, rather than sort of sitting there in his ivory tower saying, oh, we should help poor people, you know, he's actually saying, I want to do it. The only thing that I have sort of it's not an issue, it's just a question really. How is this thing going to take shape? I know he's visiting.
But he was going to try and build some houses on his own land, wasn't he?
So that was one of the things that was suggested. He's also been visiting, I think, 3 places today, another 3 tomorrow, which will form sort of centres for some kind of homeless projects. You know, good on him. I say good on him. He's a working royal. What else is he supposed to do? I mean, we can't sort of fault him for wanting to do better.
Lord Lilley.
One thing he isn't doing is he's not preaching to other people. He's saying he is going to devote time, effort, energy and some of his land to try and help do something about this. And that seems to be entirely commendable.
Do you think that it's slightly odd that the future monarch has to step in and deal with this instead of the government?
It's not instead of the government. It is one of the most intractable problems.
Yes.
Any of us who walk past people, you know, I agonise with myself. Should I give them some money? No, it'll go immediately on drugs. Should I walk straight past? How mean and vile of me. Every day. But is there a solution to it? I guess this question might come up, and I'd look to see whether anyone had ever said there is a definitive solution, and not even GT has got a definitive solution. So it can't do any harm to have someone like him. He's got convening power. He's got William Hague involved. He's a formidable person. He was my number 2 at the Department of Social Security. He's thought about these issues a lot in the past. He's got undoubtedly other people from other parties. And it's not really a divisive political issue. There isn't a party in this country that wouldn't like to solve this problem if it could.
Just, Christine.
I think we would all agree on this. I can't see anything wrong with him helping out. He's trying to do a good thing. And I don't think he should be
Do you think people will sneer, though, Christine, at him?
No, I think people will wait and see what it is he's actually going to do and what he's going to try and do. And it is, as Peter says, an intractable problem in this country. Not long after I was elected in 2017, not long after that, in what was then the 5th richest economy in the world, a homeless person died in the entrance at Westminster Tube to the House of Commons. That's how bad it is in this country. That's, you know, it's a crisis. And I have people coming to me every week, and I'm sure every MP in the country does, with people who are facing homelessness. And if Prince William thinks he can help and that he can make a difference, then good on him, and he should have our support.
Dorothy.
Sorry, he didn't say he would help. He said he would end homelessness in 5 years. And I'm afraid it was such a naive statement. And these problems are not utterly intractable. If we had a more sensible drugs policy, if we actually built in this country the number of houses that we need, and if we hadn't allowed Margaret Thatcher to sell them all off, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems. The answer to the problem of homelessness is many excellent, well-thought-through policies, not a nice, well-meaning young man who himself owns £1 billion.
Lord Lilley shaking his head about the selling off of council houses. Go on.
Well, I think it's irrelevant. It's a political point. There's no relevance to this at all.
Oh, it does.
Oh, of course not. The idea that it is a shortage of houses. There is a huge shortage of houses for reasons because we allow the population of Birmingham to enter this country net every 2 years and we don't build houses for them. That is a problem. But the people I pass home for down and outs every day in my morning walk. And the idea that they would have been able to live in council houses and that they're now not because the 20% of council houses...
I have people come to me every week, every single week, families who cannot get a house in Edinburgh because there aren't sufficient social houses. And it's because when the houses were sold off, we didn't reinvest in building social housing. That's why it's relevant now.
Point is made.
We didn't do it then.
Point is made. OK, let's go to our next question, a text question from Jen in Clapham. Is the traditional office a thing of the past? This is on the back of HSBC, the bank, announcing that it is moving out of its skyscraper in Canary Wharf and into smaller premises in the City of London, saying the rise of working from home has removed the need for having a large office building. Dorothy Byrne, you've run Channel 4. What would you be doing? What do you think about the office working being a thing of the past?
I think that working in offices is really good for people, and it's where about half of people meet their future partners.
That could create some problems.
They're going to end up without anybody. And it's where you come together and you're really creative. Do you need to do that 5 days a week? Maybe not. But I really, really believe in the importance of human beings meeting each other to do a job.
So it's not the thing of the past, but it's downsizing makes sense to you.
You have to rethink it now.
And also young people who need to learn skill sets when they go into the world of work, about being spontaneous, about sparking ideas off each other, about that moment when they think they've sorted something and then they speak to somebody else and it gives them another perspective. And I think the other thing that hasn't been sort of factored into the conversation that people often have about work from home is what about those of us who are on the receiving end of those who work from home. Quick example, I was dealing with somebody the other day. I'm involved in a project that they're sort of sorting out, and the internet kept going off. So every time we tried to have a conversation and move on, I'm really sorry, the signal's really bad in my area. Well, get into an office where they have decent Wi-Fi and decent phone systems.
You also learn a lot from observing, don't you, from people in the office?
100%.
Huge amount, exactly.
I think there's a lot of mental health issues that come from people being isolated at
Christine.
home.
I think we need some flexibility. People need to be able to choose, but again, an example, my own office at the end of COVID, when we were thinking about going back into the office, everybody was a bit kind of, well, I've quite enjoyed working from home. As soon as we got back into the office, we remembered all the advantages, the fun that you can have in an office. Yes, there's tension sometimes, but sparking off people, meeting new people, the social life that comes from it. But people need the choice, because some people will, for lots of different reasons, want to work at home some of the week. Okay. So that's what we have to do.
Lilley.
Yes, some people want to, if employers believe it's good for their staff and can persuade their staff it's good for them, then I suspect lots more people ought to be at work, in the office than are. But equally others who can perfectly satisfactorily work at home, it shouldn't be for us to lay it down. It should be for the employers in a company to say what's good for their staff and what's good for the productivity of their staff. And they don't seem to be able to enforce that on their staff, which is very odd.
Well, it's also becoming a competitive dynamic for companies about what they do in terms of these flexible patterns to attract staff in as well. OK, it's time for our fun question, always designed to instill fear in every panellist who comes on here. This is from Joanna in Liverpool. With the fifth and final Indiana Jones film coming out this week, which classic film or series would you bring back next? Angela?
I'd like to see another Bridget Jones film, because they signed off after 3 and, she'd had a baby, she'd moved on, whatever. But come on, because she's so politically incorrect, she's so of her time, I would just love the kind of the fallout that would come from trying to squash her into, postmodernist, post-millennial, woke-friendly.
Bridget Jones working from home.
Yeah, exactly. Woking from home.
Working from home.
I was hoping you'd start at the other end and there wouldn't be time to do with me. I can't remember any series that I want brought back, really. I'd like to see another sort of... The films I liked, I'm so out of date, were things like Dr. Zhivago. Yeah. I'd like a few more Dr. Zhivago's.
You'd like another Bridget
classic.
Jones, wouldn't you, Lord?
I've not
Lilley?
seen any Bridget
Maybe.
Dr.
Jones.
Zhivago is a classic film. Christine.
I probably would.
Actually, I tend not to like, with actually the exception of the Bridget Jones movies, I didn't think I would like them when they did the third one. I thought, oh God, but it actually worked. But I tend not to like when they revisit old films because it's just a disappointment. I remember going to see, I'm not going to name it because I don't want to upset anybody, but I remember going to see the latest in a series in a movie that was brought back, and after the first 10 minutes thinking, what am I doing here? This is awful. So I tend to think you should leave well alone.
Dorothy?
Well, the first love of my life was Lee Majors. So I would bring back Bonanza, and they could use new technology to recreate Lee Majors, and then old ladies in old people's homes all over Britain could just enjoy the beauty and gorgeousness of Lee Majors all over again.
Fantastic. Well, I enjoyed Top Gun Maverick. I thought it was actually superb and really well made by Tom Cruise, who did brilliantly and directed that brilliantly. What a fantastic panel we've had this evening. Really interesting and lively discussion. Many, many thanks to Dorothy Byrne, Christine Jardine, Lord Peter Lilley and Angela Epstein for joining me this evening. Thank you very much indeed for all your calls and texts as well. Coming up next, this is an interesting piece that I read today, and it's entitled this: Festival Drugs Tests. Artists and MPs write open letter to the government. This is about a group of musicians and MPs urging the government to allow on-site drug testing at festivals to go ahead. The letter calls on ministers to reconsider the Home Office requirement for festival organisers to have a licence to actually do this drug testing. And they say that drug testing undoubtedly saved lives, but they want these festival organisers to have proper licences in place. My question to you, which I'm pondering, is this: would on-site drug testing at festivals lead to effective legalisation of drugs?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, following the brief uprising by Wagner forces in Russia over the weekend, President Putin has given a statement in the last hour.
The organizers of this rebellion cannot but understand that they will be brought to justice. Everybody understands that. This is criminal activity which is aimed at weakening the country, and this was a colossal threat. From outside, we are threatened.
His pre-recorded address lasted for 5 minutes. In it, he also thanked the president of Belarus for helping to bring about a resolution to the rebellion on Saturday, which resulted in Wagner forces marching on Moscow until they were halted 120 miles from the city. That order to halt came from the company's head, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has today denied he was attempting to overthrow the government. The United States and NATO have insisted they had no involvement in the attempted mutiny. Also this evening, Moscow is claiming Russian fighter jets have been scrambled after at least 2 RAF planes were detected near the country's border. In a statement, the Kremlin's Ministry of Defense claimed the British planes made a U-turn and Russia's state border was not violated. The Ministry of Defense has been contacted for a comment. An inquest says there is no evidence the mother of 2, Nicola Bully, was harmed before she drowned in the River Wyre in Lancashire in January. It also heard the 45-year-old could have stopped struggling within seconds of going into the water. LBC's Alice Sofield reports now from Preston.
A pathologist has given drowning as a cause of death, saying the condition of Nikki's body was what you'd expect to see. It was suggested she could have suffered from cold water shock as the water was around 4 degrees the day she went missing. We've also heard from Lancashire Police and from people who were in St Michael's that morning. None of them noticed anything suspicious. I'm LBC's Alice Sofield at the inquest in Preston.
A man's died after being stabbed on a tram in Nottingham. Police say it happened this morning in the Basford area and an arrest has been made. And anti-monarchy campaigners have criticised the Prince of Wales' new project to try to end homelessness, saying privileged people with multiple homes are part of the problem. William's initiative called